and a one and a two, and we are live. And I'm in here with the esteemed Burgermeister,
Howdy, howdy.
the fellow host with the most, and we got Withered Rose on here, and he is going to be talking about traditionalism.
Thanks for having me on.
Oh, well, thank you for coming on, dude. We definitely appreciate it. And obviously, I mean, you made the distinction with traditionalism with a capital T, not a lowercase t. And as far as like it being a foundational philosophy for a school of thought, or a philosophical school of thought. So, yeah, go ahead and tell us a bit more about it.
Right, so there is a big distinction between capital T and lowercase t traditionalism. And lowercase t traditionalism can be just about anything. It's, sometimes referred to as like a true adherent to a certain tradition. So, traditionalist Catholics, for example, talk about being the true Catholics, the faithful ones. Sometimes it's used as a smear, a traditionalist, it's the living faith of the dead versus tradition, which is the dead faith. No, I forget it, but it's there's a cool, catchy way of putting it. But the accusation is that a traditionalist has a dead faith, whereas somebody who follows tradition has a living faith. That's the accusatory way of putting it.
Worshipping the ashes instead of carrying the fire.
Yeah, that's a better way of putting it. But this is different from what I want to talk about, what I've been interested in for the past year or so now, and that's uppercase T, traditionalism, which is actually a modern school of thought and philosophy. Started really with a man named René Guénon, although you have traces a bit earlier. And he was a French Catholic that later became a Sufi Muslim, but somehow thought, and maybe we can get this later, that you could still be a Catholic while also being a Sufi, which is a hard circle to square. But essentially the core of capital T traditionalism is that there's this primordial tradition that reaches back to the beginning of mankind. But through the generations, we've lost contact with that. And we sprouted a multiplicity of traditions. But if we look into all different traditions, we see there's certain common elements. For example, there's on all traditions, faith traditions, that is, whether it's Greek, Hindu, Roman, paganism, or if it's Christianity, Judaism, Islam, there's a common theme that you have. There's a point, the Greeks would call it the Golden Age, where man is in harmony with God. And then you have a gradual falling away, where you have the Silver Age, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age. And the Iron Age is, in Hinduism, is called the Kali Yuga. And with Christianity, you can see that you start off with the Garden of Eden, and then man slowly gets away from God. And the further away from God you get, the more disorder you get. And then eventually you come around to a new Golden Age. You can see this in the Old Testament, for example, where when Israel is faithful to God, things are going pretty dandy. Then they start to drift slowly away, and things get worse and worse until they face invasion or some sort of famine or catastrophe. Then they come back to harmony with God, being a new Golden Age. So you see these, common elements throughout all of religions. And what somebody like Guénon would say is that, okay, these are surviving fragments of this primordial tradition, and hence traditionalism is calling back to that primordial tradition and seeing what elements are universal in all religions, this perennial wisdom, this wisdom that's kind of ingrained in the human experience, these archetypes, and then relying upon those to to live a better life.
Yeah, in that sense, it's kind of a sort of right-wing ecumenism, if you will.
Yeah, I would hesitate about saying right wing, because although the political tendencies of traditionalism tend to be right-wing, it didn't start off as a political movement. It was purely philosophical school of thought. And it later got picked up by people interested in politics. But I mean, with anything that's ancient is going to be right-wing by our standards today. So the traditionalist school emphasized hierarchy. They defended the caste system, the idea that you're born into a specific class because of the nature of your soul. So if I was born an aristocrat, that means that by providence, I was meant to be there by divine grace. So there are definitely right-wing elements, or the whole idea that the corporeal world, the world of becoming, that passes away. This is kind of like sand; it will pass away, but the eternal, the world of being, is what's important. So you do have different elements that are more comfortable with the right wing, but I want to emphasize that traditionalism, as such, is not a political movement or school of thought.
Right. I meant it more by association and tendency rather than strict definition. But yeah.
It's definitely associated with it. Yeah.
Likewise, ecumenism is often associated with more liberal forms of Christianity. So just kind of a shorthand understanding.
Right. Yeah.
Well, and it was definitely speaking to kind of a traditionalist of the Orthodox Church would probably be in the vein of a Father Seraphim Rose, where he talked about the pan-heresy of ecumenicism and warning about all the little t traditions of the coming New Age and the new waves of the New Age movements and how it would progress through time as to an affront to the Orthodox Church.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of dangers with it. And you can see some elements with perennial philosophy in general. And perennial philosophy is kind of another name for the traditional school of thought. And you do see some overlap between that and New Agey stuff. Yeah, lots of weird magic and tarot cards and stuff. But that's kind of one of the ways it gets pulled into. But interestingly enough, Father Seraphim Rose, someone that was very key to his coming away from atheism, was Rene Guénon. He talks about that in the life and works of Seraphim Rose.
Now, with that, like being the foundation of not so much, like you said, a political or really a religious philosophy, because it's not steeped in either, but obviously us being human beings and being geared towards, well, in a sense, politics and religion, and in the Western, especially the United States sensibilities, those two kind of things blending themselves together. And as you have like politicians using religion for their own gain, and I don't want to get too political with it, but they blend those traditions together. So you get those philosophies mixed, and then you get those, well, obviously those theories mixed, and I'm not talking about Christianity being a theory, but you interject it with political theory or political schools of thought or political traditions. So it's a launching off point, I guess, for what would be considered, well, right wing thought today. So therefore, you have that blending and that interjection into what's thought as not the bare bones, and what you're pulling out with it, Rose, the bare bones big T traditionalism, whereas people are, like you said, overlapping it with something like perennialism and creating a whole another section of it, which is could be kind of running wild, and replacing different forms of spirituality with, with what you're not getting from a religion, what you're not getting from a faith that you follow, because now you're just replacing it with, like you said, new age kind of traditions.
Yeah. And when you talk about politics and religion and philosophy getting mixed together, well, that's natural though, because politics, philosophy, and religion are they form the trinity of worldview, and so they're three poles to the same object, and so naturally they are going to seep into one another. But you have to see all of them as being their own distinct object at the same time, and knowing where each one applies in what situation. So, with that said, talking about Seraphim Rose, I would say that this is actually a very good segue into talking about the compatibility of the traditionalist school with Christianity, which was what we kind of wanted to cover first.
Yeah, that is a good transition. And I think you made the good point, JP, that traditionalism is never a substitute for religion. It is always a stepping stone. It's a launching off point. And a lot of traditionalist thinkers would say it just as much themselves, such as Schuon, Fritjof Schuon emphasized that you need to be within a specific tradition. So you have people like Evola, that were definitely more pagan. Then you have people like Olavo de Carvalho, who is a devout Roman Catholic. But when it comes to the compatibility of traditionalism with Christianity, it really hinges upon the idea of the Sophia Perennis, perennial wisdom, versus what St. Justin Martyr called the sieved form of Christ in all things. And what St. Justin was saying, and this was in the 2nd century, and he was talking to different pagans, specifically Greek and Roman pagans, is he saw elements in their mythology that pointed towards Christ. And he developed this idea that in God's providence, he put a bridge towards Christ in all things. So no matter if you're a Greek pagan, a Hindu, a Roman, and if he was alive today, he might extend it to contemporary philosophies, for example, maybe something like phenomenology, maybe even deconstruction, that no matter how big the bridge, there's nonetheless a bridge there. And one of the famous examples he uses is the Egyptians, right? So they have the idea of God incarnate. That's what they thought Pharaoh was. Right concept, but wrong classification, not classification, wrong identification. Where if you look at somebody like Plato, he argued that there is a supreme good that is the source of goodness and the source of all being, and that this is what we should adore rather than these weird Greek gods that are running around just doing horrible stuff. If you read the Iliad, if you read the Odyssey, they're not very good gods. They're not people you want to worship. Well, he has the right idea, right? There is a source of being that is a source of all goodness and it's beyond comprehension. But it's not this abstract form. Rather, it's a personal being. It's a personal deity. So if you can take a look at, instead of saying, okay, there's this primordial tradition that we can kind of piece together, which is problematic for the Christian, because that means that Christianity is not really the truth. Christ is not really the truth. He's not really the way. He's not really the life. Rather, he's just elements of this primordial tradition. That's incompatible. But if you say rather, the Logos is the primordial tradition. That, in the beginning was the Word, and then, and the Word implanted the truth of all things into all different philosophies and religions. So that way we can all reach Christ no matter where we are from. If I was born a Hindu, born a Greek pagan, was born a Muslim, there's something in it that I can look to and say, okay, that's where I can see the fulfillment of those things in Christ. So you can still look to all different religions and see, oh, look, there's these common themes. For example, we talked about earlier, there's a common theme of a being close towards God is a golden age, and when you fall farther and farther away, eventually you get catastrophe. And that's straight out of the Old Testament. Now, the Greeks used different idioms to talk about it. They talk about the different ages, but that's right there in the Old Testament. So it's the same concept, different idiom. Or if you talk about, there's always an emphasis, especially in Ganon, that the world of being is more important than the world of becoming. And this echoes, or rather, this points towards what Christ said, this world will pass away, but my words will not. They will endure forever into the ages of ages. So we can look at these different commonalities between religions and look at them in a Christian light and say that, okay, yes, there are these common themes to the human experience. There's something deep within the human psyche that we have these ideas and archetypes, these different themes. But they're there because the Logos implanted them. And he is the primordial tradition. In the beginning was the Logos.
Indeed. Oh, go. I don't know if you want to talk, JP.
Well, there's certainly, and even if you look into something like, and I know Carl Jung is not into traditional school of thought, but there's something that so resounding and reverberating through somebody like Carl Jung identifying the archetypes, because you have archetypes all over the place. And like you said, there's something deep within the human psyche, and Carl Jung played more into that, which says that those archetypes exist for a reason. And that could that be through biblical genealogy? Yeah. Could that be through the 12 tribes of Israel? Yeah. Because every time you had a tribe of Israel fall away from God, well, it took them a while to get back to God. And once they got back to God, they fell away again, came back, fell away again, came back. So it's that struggle, but it's still that belief in a Logos. And, it follows through with the Christology. It follows through with the ecumenical councils, and that becoming, basically the dogmatic doctrine of the church. And obviously Christ being the center of it. Well, then you have those different launching off points, as I said, and as I'm continually critical of Western Christianity, those archetypes shine through. You're going to have a priest that is in it for the money, not in it for the faith. So you're going to have those archetypes come through, in either virtue or vice. And I don't, I'm not trying to add too many layers to the cake, but in a sense that is, he's the priest is falling away from the church. He's going to be excommunicated, hopefully. But as an example, he is succumbing or becoming a prisoner to his own vices. And that in and of itself, a priest that's caught up in the world becomes, an archetype on the evil side. So you see that, reverberating, and then eventually, hopefully he comes back, and comes back to Christ. I know that's, kind of a personal aspect of it, but to personify it, as human beings, we have that tendency. And I think, with those tendencies and creating those little t traditions, that's when everything just starts running amok and running wild, and we forget about, or we lose the focus, and we take the focus off of, what Christianity is supposed to represent.
Right, and Carl Jung was not a traditionalist in the proper sense of capital T, but he was interested in some alchemical stuff, which is something that a lot of capital T traditionalists got into. because kind of the idea of alchemy was to transform an impure substance into a pure substance. So melding down kind of the unnecessary elements of wisdom down to their core, right? To the truth that came back in the primordial times. But I did kind of throw out the idea of the psyche, archetypes, deliberately Jungian terms, because there are a lot of people that might be hesitant towards traditionalism. There are some weird characters involved with it, and there's a lot of criticisms to be made of it, if I'm going to be fully honest. However, a lot of people are more open to Carl Jung, and what Jung was tapping into was very much the same thought as the uppercase T traditionalists, except with a more psychological rather than religious bend.
Yeah. And with archetypes, this doesn't even apply just to persons or to psychology. It extends all the way even into politics, because I forget which Greek philosopher it was that said that each polity, each form of government has an ascended and a fallen form. Talking about the difference between monarchy and tyranny, or uh, democracy and anarchy, I think it was. Yeah. Thank you, Rose. Yeah, it was Aristotle. But I can't exactly word everything he said, but that same concept, right? You can apply archetypes in all different kinds of areas, and sort of the dark mirror image of the ideal, which is where you get concepts like the Antichrist. And so it's a very universal concept.
Well, and then you have the word anti, which is another derivative in and of itself, and a whole spiel of archetypes with that, because anti not only means against, but it also means to replace. So when you replace a monarchy with a tyrannical government, or as a placeholder, through tyrannical autocracy, then you lose the will of the people. Well, then there's a whole archetype there. If you lose the will of the people, you lose the will of the government. There lies a driving force with it. And I haven't heard that Aristotle thing in quite a while. that took me back to college a bit. But you like you said, there's something that goes against it, and there's something that's going to replace it. So, in a sense, ascendancy and descendancy. So therein lies the, mirroring and refracting, or whatever term you want to use, or parallel. And there's that's so prominent across, every walk of life. There's definitely that going on with constantly within the world. It's never a static thing.
And the real question is when you start to see these themes pop up, such as the mirroring phenomenon, the concepts of the antis, all these different kind of perennial themes or archetypes, right? You see these in all things. You have to ask yourself, okay, why is this happening? Why do we see the same archetypes pop up in every tradition? Why do kind of every epic story, epic poem, whether we're talking about Sumerian legends or Greek legends or Roman legends, Egyptian legends, why can we see kind of the same heroic archetypes? Why do we see the notion of when you're close to the divine, things go well. When you fall away from the divine, things go bad. Why do we see the idea that there is a specific providence to place people in different positions? Or the idea that nations are founded by gods? Why do we see this? And we have to kind of come to a conclusion that, all right, either we can do the materialistic route and say that this is some Darwinian selection method, that for some reason these beliefs are necessary for our survival, which I think is kind of ridiculous. There's because Darwinian evolution does not select for truth; it selects for survival, right? So I could believe that I'm really a bird that's been cursed by an evil witch, and that's why I can't fly. So I'm not going to jump off a mountain. So I'm still going to survive because I'm not going to do anything stupid. But it's a false belief, right? And that belief is equally selectable by Darwinian evolution than me believing that I'm just a human, which I am for anyone asking. I'm not a bird. So that explanation kind of gets ruled out. So we say, okay, why is these themes implanted in us? Why are these, core pieces of wisdom implanted in us if it's not through evolution? Then we're either going to say that there's this primordial tradition that we can piece together that we no longer have access to, or there's a primordial tradition that we still have access to. And the latter would be the Christian, uppercase T, traditionalist position, because this tradition ultimately comes from Christ. Because you have to answer the question somehow. Like, why do we see these themes in all religions and all philosophy? Why can we? It's almost inescapable. Why can we not get away from these things? They're clearly important, and you have to explain them somehow.
Yeah, and I think you hit on a very salient point there about Christianity, which is that it is a still extant tradition. And coming from my view, the idea of continuity and maintenance of tradition and the fact that it does not go away and then resurface later, but it is a constant thing that even though it may wax and wane, it survives because it is the truth. And that's, to me, is why orthodoxy rings so strongly with me, because it is the unbroken continuation of Christ's church on earth. It has not once lapsed in existence for 2,000 years. And when you consider that, we consider any other religious institution today that has existed in a singular, unitary, organized form, very few can make that claim. So, that is a very strong argument for Christian, capital T, tradition. But there's another argument to be made about it, which is that if you're looking at these different perennial traditions and you're saying, oh, well, if everything has elements of the truth, then that means Christianity is incomplete. No, it doesn't. Because what you're doing there when you say this is you're implying an inherent equality to all forms of belief. It is subliminal egalitarianism that causes you to think this way. And when you accept that that's not true, that egalitarianism is not a given, in fact, in most cases, it simply doesn't exist, then of course not. Christianity has the tradition, and these others have elements of it that will then allow them to come to Christianity in different ways. But that doesn't demean or lessen the value of Christianity at all. In fact, it only demonstrates just how right it is.
Right, and I think there's a problem with traditionalism if you don't have an excellent tradition, because you run into this problem of how do you verify if something is a universal truth or universal error? Now, universal errors, the question is, all right, how common are they? But if you believe that we're fallen and that man is given to sin, and I don't think you need to be a Christian to believe that. I mean, I know what's in the heart of a decent man, and I shudder to think what's the heart of a criminal. We naturally are given towards pride. We're unfortunately not very pretty creatures. If you turn on the news, you can see what we do. So it would not be surprising if, as a species, we come up with different beliefs that serve us, that, serve our lust for power or whatever. So there's a real question of how do we know if, we see the belief of reincarnation present in all civilizations. You see it in some, you don't see them in all, so it's not perennial in that sense. But maybe there's some reason to believe in reincarnation, right? Maybe, it serves my political ends to say, okay, yeah, I am actually the reincarnation of the great emperor 100 years ago, because that puts me in power, right? Now, that's maybe not the actual truth of the matter, but we can see that that could be a political motive. So then there's a question of, all right, how do we parse out what's a universal error from a universal truth? And for that, you're going to need something to compare it against. I can't know a line is curved unless I have some idea of a straight line. And that is why I'm a Christian and a traditionalist at the same time. It's because I think we can judge universal truth from universal error by looking at Christianity and see, what does faith teach?
Well, then look at a heretic like Origen and what he tried to accomplish through his heresies. Not only Gnosticism in a sense, but trying to create that whole universality or universalism, which is still pretty prominent today. And like you said, it's those different delineations of the truth, that with it being with some truth, with no truth, with like 75% of it, there's all different shades of gray. And you have a guy like Origen who just, in a sense, did he go off the rails? He could have, but at that time period, who the heck knows, maybe even what he's even talking about. But he did hit a lot of nails on the head with something like Christology, the eternal logos of Christ, and that obviously has a ton of momentum to it because of orthodoxy being as preserved as it is. But then you have the other side of it where universalism in a sense is also ecumenicism and apostasy. Now we have those two derivatives of it because of the heresy that Origen created from that universalistic aspect. So, in a sense, a blessing in disguise that we're able as Christians to identify that and know what it is and have the foundation and the wherewithal to have that as well in this time period to see, what the Bible warns against. Things like sorcery, witchcraft, all, the New Age, that whole gamut, to where you have that universality is not always necessarily going to be a universality of truth. Sure, like you said, we're prideful creatures, and you always hear somebody talking about my truth, their truth, as if it's some kind of religious pontification. Well, yeah, sure, in a sense it could be, but is it going to serve a purpose or serve some good in somebody's life? Epiphanies come and go, So it could, it could happen. It could help people out. But in the other sense, it all depends on what road they're going down exactly. So you have, I guess, kind of a wolf in sheep's clothing. It's kind of a metaphor I'm using with this. But then on the other turn, in the other sense, well, Christ wasn't called the Lion of Judah for nothing. So you have these various ways of going about it, and these different universal archetypes interjecting themselves on a continuous basis, and it being a common theme. Throughout the centuries of time, it even was there pre Old Testament and pre New Testament, and you could see that throughout the various ancient cultures of the earth.
Yeah, and when you said witchcraft, kind of a spark just went off my head is that just because something is universal in theme doesn't mean it's universal in tone. For example, every religious tradition in the ancient world believed in the reality of witchcraft and sorcery. They believed that there's people that could communicate with spiritual entities and that they could cause effects in the material world. So that's universal, but the tone is different. For a lot of pagans, this was a good thing. We want to communicate with these spirits. For Christians, however, we're told in the Old Testament, for example, there's some pretty severe penalties against people that do this, for witches and stuff, and for warlocks. So there is actual punishment set up in the Old Testament for people that do this. And it's like, okay, we're the Hebrew superstitious people, and he believes in witches and stuff. Or do they recognize that there are such a thing as demons, and you can get power from demons? And it was the early church's position that the pagan gods were in fact demons. And on the note of the gods, something that's really interesting, and this is I'm getting this from G.K. Chesterton's The Everlasting Man, which is a book I highly recommend. It was instrumental in C.S. Lewis's conversion. Actually, J.R. Tolkien gave him this book, and it helped him convert to Christianity from atheism. And in The Everlasting Man, Chesterton makes a point to say that in all pagan religions, if you look at their creation myth, they all begin with there being one God who created the world. There's this very vague, creator God. And then all of a sudden, there's these different spiritual entities that pop up that are created after the world is created. And then man starts to worship these different spiritual entities. So in the beginning, you have, I'm blanking on the name, but you have the one God in Greek mythology. Then you get people like Gaia, and then they have their children, the Titans, and they have their children, the Olympians. And man kind of shifts from worshiping one to the other to another. And now you do see this in Christianity, don't you? You see there being one God, the true God, who creates the angels, and then Satan falls. And then we worship his offspring, the demons, right? Those who fell with them. So this is a universal theme, but change in tone, where across all ancient religions, all ancient traditions, philosophies, we see there being one God, creating spiritual entities, then man worshiping them. But in Christianity, you see the truth, and we see that worshiping these different entities is actually a bad thing. So it's not just a matter of, okay, what's universal and what's not, but it's, okay, what's the tone of that truth?
Yeah, and what sort of grasp on reality does that have, right? Because when you cross-examine this idea of witchcraft and this idea of connecting to the other world, to the spiritual or the immaterium, what it kind of strikes me as is human hubris, because it almost has kind of the same tone as people who believe that they can understand the true nature of God in its entirety. Because it's on a lesser scale, but yes, it's people reaching and trying to interact with beings that are on a higher plane than they are fundamentally in existence. It's stepping out of their natural place in the natural order of existence, and in doing so, and engaging in an act of arrogance and hubris. But in the Hebrew tradition, and which evolved into the Christian one, we see that is what you're doing is, I wouldn't so much say that demons are empowering people as much as that demons are possessing people. They're using them for their purposes, because these arrogant, haughty humans who think that they can go into a plane above their capacity are instead going to get used by this plane's entities for nefarious ends. This is why witchcraft is bad. It's because you as a human cannot comprehend and understand these planes above you, and so attempting to do so will get you, manipulated and worn like a sock by all these often malevolent entities that are simply above you in capacity and understanding.
Well. I mean, you just said human hubris, which is, in my point of view, very humanistic or humanism philosophy. But you have all those little t traditions running around. And then, like, for a good reason why the Bible warns against sorcery and witchcraft is because you invite those spirits in. And as Rose said, with the pagans trying to control that immaterial spiritual realm, I mean, were they achieving it? I don't know. Have I heard some crazy stories about it? I have. One that's the most vivid for me is one of my best good friends. He's now like seeking out Christianity, and he's becoming more aware of like the benefits of it. He told me that he was in a desert with almost nothing, and he's really big into the old Aztec, Incan, Mayan, those kind of quote unquote religions, belief systems. Out of nowhere, a medicine man, witch doctor, I don't know what I would classify him as. He's not like, I guess, the witch doctor in the old sense, I guess the new sense, so it's more of a medicine man. He literally pulled out a ringworm from somebody's intestine just by shoving his hand down the guy's throat and saving his life. So, I mean, there's definitely some power to that. And is that necessarily something that's bad? Is it pagan? Yeah. But he saved the guy's life. So I guess, it's a great thing. But, I mean, there's obviously powers and principalities that we just don't know about. And I mean, yeah, we could spurg on the elite doing what they do, quote unquote, the elite. And them trying to ascend God. Well, we all know where that wound up with somebody who fell. And I mean, it's very different, like growing up with kind of a religion, and trying to like codify it or categorize it or even quantify it in the Western sense. But when you hear about capital T traditionalism intermingled with Orthodox Christianity, thank you, Rose, the theology becomes ever more present. And it gets to the point where all of that Western, Eastern, New Age, mixed up stuff, low T traditionalism, kind of doing whatever its thing. Because that's dynamic too, because obviously the spiritual world is probably a pretty dynamic place, I would imagine. That you have that intermingling and that commingling of, like you said, Berger, the people who, get possessed. And sure, I mean, are there always going to prey? Are there demons that are always going to prey upon the weakest? Yeah, I mean, that could be a little bit Darwinian of me to say that. But there's also, to a point, there's also a momentum that the forces of good and evil are always striving for. And there's archetypes of that. I mean, everywhere. I mean, you're bombarded on the daily. And, it's funny because looking at the mainstream news, you can see somebody, on Commie News Network saying something, and then you could flip the channel to a right-wing station, and they're saying something different in a different context, but they might be kind of saying the same thing. So, you have that dynamic, and in a way, people pulling for souls, but not necessarily souls that are, of the afterlife. They're souls that are here in the here and now and trying to grip and gain hold or a foothold to control, your soul, your destiny, and this world. So there's a lot at play there, and I know I kind of just went off the rails a little bit on that. But the point being is that those forces are always going to be dynamic. There's a reason why the church and the church fathers obviously weren't against it. I mean, they fought Gnosticism for, who knows how long. And, there comes a point to where all those things, as the Bible said, will eventually reveal themselves.
Well, I guess I get to rant a little again. But yeah, that's true. The revelation, and this is an important thing, revelation through, knowledge given by God, as opposed to, what we think we're discovering on our own. That's a whole nother topic. But yeah. And something I want to add to this idea of these demons that are influencing the material plane through possession is that the reason that it's always demons and you really don't see angels doing the same thing is because, well, they're getting out of their plane of existence. They would be committing the same sin that humans doing that would be, which is exiting their natural dominion, as assigned by God. And I think this is why you see things like the Holy Spirit acting on earth rather than angels. Because the Holy Spirit is God's own energy. It is God himself. He's not restricted to a plane, within his natural order. And it's also why you had the incarnation of the Son. It is him acting in accordance with his own laws and his own, the very framework of existence that he created. There's that eternal consistency with how God operates. And so, yeah, it's just all logical. It all links together and makes sense when you really look at the framework, the natural order of existence, and how it's all very, very logical in that sense. At least so the parts of it that we can really understand.
And that goes back to the whole concept of the mirror, right? There's the real thing, there's the anti. The question of initiation rituals is always a big deal in traditionalist writings. The idea that when you go into a certain role, whether it's a clerical role or a regal role, you are initiated into a new order. And this is through a seal of a spirit, usually, or through some trial. Well, there is a true initiation ritual, for those of us who are Christians, who are Orthodox, and that's baptism and chrismation. And you can see other religions also have initiation rituals through oil as well, not through immersion in water, but through different oil rituals. But the question is, what spirit's doing that, right? Is it the Holy Spirit, or is it a demonic spirit? So we can see that there's a mirror image of things, right? And this is, James brought this up. Antios means to replace. The Antichrist is to replace Christ. Well, there's all sorts of different hermetical, alchemical replacements for the sacraments, even if they came before them. This could be, the devil anticipating the Christian sacraments and trying to create substitutes to get people hooked on, the fake stuff so they don't go towards the good stuff.
Yeah, the black sacraments, as it were. That's a key aspect of just about anybody that calls themselves Satanist, but it also exists in many other forms that are not as open about it. That's precisely what that is. It is a mockery. It's a desecration of the concept of a holy sacrament. By its very nature, it doesn't even have to be attempting to do so, but it simply is, because it is an imposter, because it stands in a place that it has not been given that right to by God. And so it is invariably a demon, an imposter, an agent of he who would call himself God that is doing this.
Well, I don't want to get too pop culture, but I guess I will now. And this goes back and this reverberates through a show I caught not too long ago. They kind of re-updated Sabrina the Teenage Witch, and they went right after it. I mean, they were no bones about it. And they went into the whole other side, and you could call it demonosis, and showing the hierarchy of hell and the natural order that hell follows. Obviously, you can mirror image that back onto heaven and see the natural order from that. And obviously, God being uncreated and God being the being that he is, and it delineate and it, coming down from him. Coming down is kind of a I guess that's a generic way to say it. But it always irks me when somebody who has a Western mind frame or a Western kind of way of thinking and say, well, if God's just a being, how can he fill all things? And I'm like, bro, that's the Holy Spirit. I'm like, you don't understand, like, there's another part to God, just like Jesus Christ is the other part to God. Like, you don't understand that how this flows and how this works itself out, to where you're just thinking, God, Holy Spirit, Jesus Christ. There's not, there's a straight line down. There's not there's a separation. Well, I don't want to say checks and balances, there's separation of powers, but in a sense, there is a separation of powers, to where, like you said, Berger, the angels don't want to do what Satan did and fall away from God and lose their station in heaven, because that's what they're there for. They're there to protect us, just as the Theotokos is. They're there to see us through life, be the angel on our shoulder, the classic angel on one shoulder, devil on the other. Sometimes, I guess in college I chose the devil more than I did the angel, but that's for a way different conversation. Anyway, we got, you have a sense of that protection. You have a sense of that order being established. Just as there is a hierarchy in hell, there certainly is and always has been a hierarchy in heaven. And to me, a lot of Western Christianity and their low T traditions forgets that there's that dynamic factor to it. It's sure, the Trinity is there, but it's dynamic. It's always there. It's through the ages, now and forever, unto the ages of ages. Amen. But there's also that there's also just that fire that gets me going. It's there, and it's obviously the fire that you just grab and you want to grab hold of, but you can't, because it comes from God, and no angel can peer upon God. So imagine, if the cherubim have to hide their eyes, just imagine to what us it must be like. And then you have those different, like Rose touched on it earlier, with the pharaohs having the right idea of the incarnation, but the wrong idea of who the incarnation was or is. And then that being in the whole, well, I guess it's more so Hellenic thought that, the logos, the eternal logos of Christ is there. And that's the true incarnation. I guess it's more Hellenic Orthodox. And it's there. Whereas the West wants to commodify it and turn it into something that is completely different and completely separate, in a hard definition as to what God is. So to me, that creates empty holes in people, and that creates more problems, and that creates those little T traditions, like I said, from running around like, well, why not? Like gremlins, and they're all over the place and they're wreaking havoc for people, and well, gremlins, demons, sure, why not? And as long as they're green-skinned men, right? So that kind of momentum builds itself, and then people get deceived. And obviously, what's the whole point of hell? Falling away from God, being away from God. So you lose that tradition. You lose those low T traditions that could lead you towards God. And in fact, it inverses, and instead of a theosis, it becomes a reverse engineered demonosis. So it's all over the place. It's so prevalent in our society, especially. And you have that overarching theme of both good and evil fighting or vying for power. And maybe this could be a segue into the political aspect of it. But as far as, I like to call it out as it is. At least we know who the godless ones are. And the problem with the godless ones is they're always trying to achieve God. They're always trying to be God. They're always trying to replace God. So that, for me, in and of itself, speaks to itself. It reverberates itself.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Yes. Sorry, you want to go?
Go ahead. I've been talking enough.
That was an Alex Jones like diatribe right there.
It's all good. Well, it's we were talking about this kind of this snowball effect. It's very similar to what the traditional school talks about with the cycle of the ages. You have the golden age where you're in harmony with God, and then you go to silver where you start to drift away, but you maintain some of the virtues. Bronze age is when you really start, the civilization really starts to detach, and you start to lose a lot of the vestigial virtues you had. Although you detach from God, you still have kind of those cultural virtues, perhaps. And then you get to the Iron Age, which is an age of war, of disillusion, anarchy, atheism, but also the mingling of the castes. And for the traditionalists, they don't just mean castes in terms of India, how we would refer to it today. What they mean is the station appointed to you by the nature of your soul. And this is what we're talking about when we talk about the demons exiting the spiritual realm and coming to our realm to try to influence us, right? They're going against their caste, their station appointed by God. Or when man tries to reach up to the divine, tries to define God, or tries to reach into the spiritual realm and capture the spiritual for his own power, that's also breaking of the caste in the traditional sense of, the station appointed by God. So we're seeing the acceleration of the cycle of the ages. And for the traditionalists, there's optimism, because the further and further you get into the Iron Age means the closer and closer you get to a new golden age, because you can only go so far away from God before necessity calls you back towards him.
Yeah, it's true. The cyclical nature of things is really, it's a not so much cyclicality as much as it is prodigality. We are all prodigal sons of our Father in heaven, and we come back to him every time that we fail, in following him, either intentionally or just through imperfection and sin. And yeah, that's kind of what happens, even if we don't intend to. Necessity, nature, reality itself brings us back to the creator, because ultimately nothing can function outside of his system. And this is kind of my own, personal theory, so I'm not going to speak as authoritatively on this. But I really think that a lot of why God allows some of the things that are so horrible to go on is just to simply, as a way of proving and as a way of just showing, just by its very nature, that no, there is no existing outside God's system. You can fight it all you want, but you're just going to keep coming back, son.
Well, then you have which is something that Peterson always says. Time is not liberals or the left. They think of time as a linear progression, whereas people who he notices were people who are more spiritually minded, people who are in touch with some kind of divinity, they see it as a cycle. They see it as something that is going to cycle through, come back, cycle through, and be prominent, as a continuation. Whew. And I mean, that just screams yin and yang to me. That is just so obviously esoteric in nature. But that yin and the yang, where you have those dynamics, I mean, good, evil, demon, angel, God, Satan. I mean, there's that whole hierarchy right there. Christ, man. So you have those breakdowns, and you have that constant Kali Yuga going through time, and having people's, what do they call it? Dispositions. You can take positions on things, or you can, kind of take a step back, re-educate yourself, and take a new position on things. So as human beings, we're dynamic creatures in our own right. And the thing that, angels already know everything, but as fallen angels, demons already know everything. But yet, demons are very jealous of us because they're eternally corrupted. So with that eternal corruption, comes in place with, why not, politics? Because I gotta rag on them too.
Yeah, we got to keep moving forward. We kind of, it was very good talk. I'm not going to say that it was a bad thing, but yeah, we really should push into politics as much as the religious aspect has been wonderful to talk about. Man. So if you want to start that ramp going, go ahead, JP.
Well, ranting, don't get me going. Kind of. Okay, so
I know you can rant.
I'm good at it.
You are. I mean, they're good rants too. They're fun to listen to.
Oh, gotta catch that beautiful butterfly, and then let it fly free. So I mean, with the whole political nature of things, obviously there's tradition and ceremony in that too. Because I mean, even if you go throughout history and look at the various traditions, both religious and political, secular, I mean, we could break it down a little bit more, but those are probably the three main aspects of civilization. So then you have that wanton, or that need for people to, like Berger said, to connect all three, right? And with politics, well, I'm going to stay away from commenting on current politics, but you have that continuation, that cyclical nature of it always coming full circle, and it always coming in a sense of, well, a meme such as Pepe or Doge, or, you know, tyranny, rebellion. You know, you have those different aspects as to how they interact with each other, how they collide, how they drift away, you know, and how they become something, a life in and of itself. So, I mean, once you catch fire, and that whole thing takes off, whichever way it may take you, there's definitely different realms of political thought and theory. But as people who are usually spiritually minded and religious, I find a very strong commonality in them, not to be so much politically motivated, unless they're in it for the money or the power. I mean, both are pretty intoxicating, but you can always respect somebody who is guided towards more of that dynamic, which is why, you know, in something in like Leviticus, they say a royal priesthood, and they say it for a reason. You know, not so much that we regard royalty as a political class or system as, you know, they're to be as revered as, I would say, the priesthood. And obviously, you know, that would be striking an interdependency and a symphonia in a way. But there's that continuation of something like a political theory. And as to traditionalism goes, I can tell you right now, I have absolutely no clue. So go ahead.
Right. So there's generally a consensus among traditionalists of what's kind of the political ideal in certain aspects, and that is bringing politics up until the religious domain, you know, that spiritual priesthood where the earthly realm, the realm of becoming, is to reflect the realm of being, the realm of God. So, for example, you have the notion of the imperium, the royal empire, which is symbolic of God's domain, because it is a political sovereignty that is beyond cultures, beyond peoples. It is all-encompassing of the world, is bestowing a certain order upon the world, you know, such as God bestowing the order upon the world. And so you have kind of a reflection of, you know, the God's domain with the imperium. You also have the idea that the sovereign is to be the first worshiper, that we to look towards the sovereign as our model for the religious life. But then the question of how you get there will vary. It varies rather differently. So there's three people that come to mind when I think of traditionalism and politics. And again, we're talking about capital T traditionalism. You have Julius Evola, who's perhaps the most well-known. You have Alexander Dugin, who's always the boogeyman from Russia, and perhaps for good reason. And then you have Olavo de Carvalho, who's down in Brazil and is currently one of the advisors, or at least was last time I checked, to Jair Bolsonaro. And they have different approaches to this. Evola, he was a weird guy, to say the least, as all traditionalists generally are, myself included.
Evola kind of reminds me of the guy in the back, like always scheming and kind of like,
yeah.
like he's got a very gremlin-like look to him.
Yeah, he's not a pretty guy. And unfortunately, this is when traditionalists get involved in politics, they are, unfortunately, Dugin does have a pretty good beard. They are kind of seen as these manipulative types because they're using, you know, current affairs for some, you know, what was seen as this weird esoteric, you know, idea. So for Evola, he was interested in fascism and National Socialism, although he had his fair criticism of both. What he liked in fascism was emphasis on the state rather than the race, which is something he saw problematic with National Socialism. Because with fascism, it kind of brought back to the idea of the monarch, right, the sovereign, was appointed by God. So the state, in that sense, right, the order that's bestowed by God comes before the people, which is symbolic of the earth, right? So you have the realm of being dominating the realm of becoming. But he had heavy criticisms of Mussolini's totalitarianism, for example. He brought this unity through an iron fist, where for the traditionalist, unity can only come about through a harmonious, organic process by the people. Whereas what he saw in National Socialism was particularly with Heinrich Himmler and the SS, is they bring back a bunch of different occult rituals in trying to create a new spiritual elite, because they saw rituals fading away in Germany. And Christianity was just, at that time, rather stagnant. It wasn't taking off. Then again, he was very critical of their racialism, because he saw that as subjecting the political, which ought to be orientated towards the realm of being, the realm of God, to the realm of becoming. Race is a very material thing that comes and goes. And, he ended up being hated by both the Italian and the German governments. He was seen as subversive as both. And then he was also seen as subversive by the Allies, during the Nuremberg trials, for being a intellectual of both sides. So he did not really put himself in a good position there. He was hated by all sides. There's a funny quote by Hitler that called Evola, I forget the exact wording of it, but he said a deformed midget trying to be a wizard or something like that. I do like Evola's work, but that's an apt criticism of him. Then you have people like Dugin, who see America as kind of emblematic of modern secular liberalism. And being for traditional order, he sees that America is enemy number one. So because of that, there's a great essay by him, if you want to get down to the nitty-gritty of his political philosophy, which is very deep, very detailed. It's a labyrinth, really. Yeah, I've read a couple of his books. I watched him his lecture series, but I'm no means a authoritative person on Dugin. There's a great essay called "The Metaphysics of National Bolshevism," which is, makes you think of the Simpson meme of Nazi commies, right? And he explains in this that National Bolshevism, the old name for his ideology before he called it Eurasianism, is essentially, okay, America is bad because it's modernism. Therefore, anything that's anti-American or anti-modern is therefore good. So he sees even communism as a reaction against modernism, because it calls back to the more communal times, right, before man became super individualistic as a result of the Industrial Revolution. So he says that communism even has a conservative or traditional element to it. And he also brings together Islamic fundamentalism as a callback to the religious nature. So it's a hodgepodge of anything that is anti-modern and anti-American. And then kind of responding to that, that's different from Evola, who had a very strong nationalistic ties to things, despite him having criticism of it. Then you have Dugin, which is kind of this anti-American, anti-liberal ideology. And then you have somebody like Olavo de Carvalho, who sees America not so much as an enemy, but as a victim. He sees this kind of this globalistic, liberal, everything is about economics, everything is about the market, about subjecting countries in the Middle East to democracy. This is rather distant from America, as it has been for most of history, because, de Tocqueville, who's a French man who came over, French intellectual, came over to survey America. He wrote 2 great volumes, Democracy in America. He says that America is essentially a collection of closely knit small communities all helping each other out. It was very communalistic, right? Everyone knows everyone in town, everyone helps each other out. And that's very different from, the shopping mall that America has become. So de Carvalho says, look, America is a victim of modernism, of liberalism, not the perpetrator. So because of that, he has a more pro-American approach and wants to reach into the West and save the elements that call back to traditional order, opposed to Dugin that sees the West as the enemy. So these are, 3 very different approaches to politics, right? One is much more radical on the right, You have Dugin, which is very anti-Western, anti-American. And you have de Carvalho that is very pro-Western and pro-American. So these are different political approaches despite them having the same philosophy and having the same general ideal of a political order, namely an empire, not in kind of the crude sense of somebody just dominating the rest of the world because of your desire for lust or power, but rather as a symbol of God's providence over the world. Looking to the sovereign as kind of the first worshiper, and then also a very set in stone caste system in which everyone, you don't really choose your own job. You're born into the job that you're seen fit for. That you were born that, an artist was born to be an artist. You don't become an artist, but you were born that way. So that's kind of it in a nutshell.
Which, doesn't necessarily mean in the same way as India, right? You always have to clarify that when you say caste system, because everyone's going to think, oh, so like India, where literally they're born, as the child of these people, meaning they cannot become anything else. No, not necessarily. And that is something that some traditionalists will say one thing, some will say another, but it's not necessarily that. So just as a clarification, but
yeah, thank you. When traditionalists say caste, they generally mean that we are born for a purpose, and that our proper role is to fulfill that purpose. Is not necessarily the Indian version of that, although that is one interpretation of that. It's kind of the problem with the whole school of philosophy of traditionalism is there's a lot of words that's being used in a very openly interpretistic sense, right? To make a new word on the spot, interpretistic. What does traditionalism mean? What tradition? Caste? You mean the Indian caste? There's a lot of words that are easily misinterpreted.
Right. But going back to Dugin, talking about him being less of a nationalist and more of an anti-nationalist towards America, well, what that comes from is his nationalism towards Russia, because this whole Duginist theme of anti-Atlanticism and of Eurasianism and the embracing of the national Bolshevik idea, what its fundamental root is it's hard to call it. There's not really a term I can think of for it, but it's almost like Russian neoconism. So basically, it's the idea that Russia, the Russian state, is the good guy no matter what, right? So that that Russia has kind of this destiny through its government to do whatever needs to be done, and that it doesn't matter what government it was under. It could be a czar, it could be a general secretary, it could be a president, but it doesn't matter. It's just whoever is in charge of it. Is kind of in the right just by virtue of that. So it's like the same kind of neocons that praise Lincoln, because that was the United States. That was this providential, blessed nation by God for some reason. That it just strikes me as being the same thing, just in reverse. So that's all that's kind of that framing that kind of comes back to that. It's probably what informed Dugin to be that way, because I know that this is a very common idea on the Russian right, and especially kind of the Russian center right.
Yes, it's Dugin's traditionalism is very Russian. There's been a long history of Russian clashes with the West, and I mean there's truth to both sides of the argument, right? There has been atrocities on both sides of people trying to impose each other's culture on. I mean, Western Europe is very different from Russia, and Russia from Western Europe. But yeah, with Dugin, he does see Russia as really as the vanguard of tradition as such, right? And this capital T tradition. So for Dugin, it's not just that, it's traditional ways of life, how people talk colloquially, but he means that Russia is the vanguard of the primordial tradition which has existed for all time. Right now, I don't know if he interprets that as a logos. He has not. I haven't read anything on how he trying to say melds and gels at the same time. I got a bit twisted there. How he brings together traditionalism and Christianity, but keep in mind for him, he thinks that Russia is the vanguard of the eternal primordial tradition. So because of that, Russia can kind of do whatever it wants. He is the vanguard of capital T truth, and it's a mirror of Dugin and Carvalho had a good debate on this back in 2003, I believe. This is before De Carvalho was brought into the Bolsonarian regime as an advisor. It was an online debate because Dugin is he is not really allowed to travel outside of Russia. He's been banned from a lot of countries, including the United States. He's seen as a radical subversive. They had a good debate, and De Carvalho says that it's really the same thing as American globalism, except that there's a national character to Russian globalism, whereas American globalism isn't really American because it does not serve America's interests. Rather, it's this weird global market, whereas Russian globalism is a mirror of that with specific national interests. So there is a definite parallel between the two.
Well, knowing absolutely nothing about Dugin, well, I know he's got a killer beard, which I can relate. But this just screams as to why I guess I attach my Americanism towards having a Greek culture, and seeing it, permeating Greek culture all the way throughout the ages and all the way throughout traditions. And obviously, right down to a good old Detroit Coney Island dog, it just reverberating in a sense to where like I can even tell walking into a Greektown restaurant and hear people speaking the language that I know, kind of. You get that vibe that you get a sense of culture. Americanism or American culture in general is not really a culture at all. And I would definitely call it little T traditionalism. And I mean, Dugin is right, because I much rather have a Russian nationalistic kind of point of view because he's Orthodox, and that screams to me, that has life to it, because obviously they embrace the truth, the absolute truth. Whereas Americanism, we got Burger King, McDonald's, root beer, maybe a little sarsaparilla, and just very Coca-Cola, Pepsi. But then again, see, that's where it starts to break down. And like you said, Rose, that it gets to the point where we try to sell America to people, and they ain't taking any bites. Well, that's the problem, because that to me says there's absolutely no truth to what we're saying. So it's just shallow, hollow emptiness. Now, if we're going to go back and talk about, the traditions of the founding fathers and what they believed and how quote unquote Christian they were, then yeah, that's going to breathe tradition. That's going to breathe in life into the embodiment as to what America is, and the foundational documents as to what this country is supposed to represent, whatever, representative democracy, if you're one of those people, or if you believe that this is just a standalone republic with democratic undertones, sure. But then you have those delineations, those breakdowns in the traditional sense. now you guys say something when it comes to a caste system. And I can't help but think of as to how that's related to in Christianity, because you have the three different main denominations of Christianity. Well, look at how kind of run amok that's become, because now you have Protestants embracing all the things of the world, right? Catholics do, in a sense. That right there, to me, kind of says, well, not only is it demonic, but it says that there's a caste system right there. Because now you see the weak-minded people who want to follow God and Christ and who probably are good Christians. And most Christians are falling away from that, who are, Protestant. They want to go to like something towards Catholicism and Orthodoxy and become, more self-aware and become better people through Christ. Whereas you have the people who are doing a complete 180 and they're like, oh, God's okay with gay people. Well, I mean, we're all going to be judged. So who are we to say, that he's not? But the screwed up part about that is that you're taking it as a human being and you're interpreting it in your own humanistic perspective. You're interpreting it as a little t tradition. Well, we all know that there's no life without the Eucharist. So, I mean, the true path of repentance and the big T traditionalism in Christianity that kind of does away with all the running back and forth, the little T traditions running around. And I guess in a sense you do have this with Catholicism. Might not be as prominent. I'm not really sure. Do I care what the Pope says? No. But you have a sense of where it's going, and that caste system kind of already reveals itself and imprints itself onto, well, I guess a self-governing body like the church, because then you have those different breakdowns in those denominations, and you're weeding out the people who are going to be the subversive Christians and the people who are going to use the church for their own ends, be it conservative or liberal, because it happens across the board and everybody's as guilty as sin on that. But to like when I, talk to liberals, when I talk to conservatives, because I'm more on the conservative side of things, I would definitely go with that. And they're like, oh, well, what kind of Christian are you? And then I tell them I'm an Orthodox Christian. They're like, you can see like their mind kind of go blank, or their mind is just blown and they don't know what it is. And then, they want to codify it. They want to politicize it. They want to turn it into something that it isn't. Well, to me right there, shows on how those denominations have kind of turned into caste systems themselves and have created, well, I guess, a wolf in sheep's clothing, rather than, putting Christ as the high priest of the church and nobody else. And, the patriarchs kind of, being the stewards of the church. So to me, like, there's no real, like, that's the hard position. That's the hard position the church needs to take, whether it be Catholic, Protestant, or Orthodox. So, you have that turnaround, and I can see why, reflecting back on it, why Dugan has those viewpoints that he does, because, as far as the whole communism, I don't even want to touch that because, that's ugly. But, then you have that interjecting itself with politics. Then you have the church interjecting itself with politics. And that's where it starts to get muddy. It starts to get ugly. And the persecutions come. And then you have people creating these memes online to kind of cope with it. And I don't know about Knotsville, but man, it's a mess.
If Dugan's position is a coherent one, because if it is true that America is spreading things that are anti-traditional, namely that this world, the material world, is more important than the world hereafter, or that an anti-caste, right, or I guess like the Christian term would probably be vocation, because the notion of caste and vocation is the same. Vocation literally means to be called. So the idea that, we're not called to certain roles, right? A father isn't called to be a certain way, or a mother isn't called to be a certain way. Rather, we can kind of do whatever we want and be however we want. We can kind of, be very fluid with gender and sexuality. These are anti-vocational or anti-caste notions, right? America is definitely spreading the idea that the material world is more important than the hereafter, against hierarchy, which is hand in hand with the caste system. Some people are born, maybe not born is the right word, but are chosen by God to rule over others. And this isn't because, there's a light that shines down from heaven and says, you, JP, shall have a YouTube channel, but rather that you're born with certain dispositions that are given by God, right? So America is promoting things that are against traditional values, traditional truths that are perennial in all ancient societies. But I think if I can, there's kind of a closing argument that de Carvalho makes in his debate with Dugan about how he agrees with all this, but he has a twist. Is it okay if I read that really quick?
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah.
All right. So he says, the description, what I can just laid out, how America has been, in the 20th and 21st century, a force of anti-tradition. This description cannot in any way be applied to the United States. It's a nation where, and I use the term Popperianism, without going to Karl Popper, just think modernism, liberalism. This is a recent implant with no local roots and totally hostile to American traditions. The United States are not the command center of the globalist project, right, the anti-tradition project, but on the contrary, is priority victim, marked to die. The globalist elite is not the enemy of Russia, China, or the Islamic countries potentially associated with the Eurasian project, right? So that's Dugan putting together Russia, communism, and Islamic fundamentalism as an anti-American force, but on the contrary is their collaborator and accomplice in an effort to destroy the sovereignty, the political military power, and the economy of the United States. So think of all the jobs being outsourced to all sorts of different countries. Think of America's military being in decline. Then also, far from favoring free enterprise capitalism, right? This is the accusation, America is so materialistic because it's the bastion of capitalism. The globalist project has supported statist and controlling policy elsewhere. And I want to get into current politics, but we can kind of, guess what that might be a reference to today. And this does not, in fact, differ from anything from the Eurasianists. Those policies that Dugan advocates are just as oppressive and invasive. And that's just, he has a longer argument, but this is kind of his rebuttal to Dugan, say, all right, yes, but this is a foreign implant upon America. And America is actually the victim of this mindset, not its progenitor. Because America has been a very communal society from the very beginning. And its origins, until the 20th century, was very much in favor with the perennial tradition.
Now, there's a lot of arguments that can be made there on that last point, but I will say that the basic premise of Carvalho's argument does stick, which is that there is no a tradition and a nation cannot be synonymous, right? Like there is no chosen people, there is no nation that is destined to bring tradition to the entire world. Like that is not, because fundamentally what that does is it exalts one group of humans, one nation over the rest of the world in an unnatural way, right? It is warping the word, the tradition, in a way to grant yourself power, to grant your nation power over the world. And this is the great sin of the Jews. One of the great sins is that they were chosen by God to incarnate His living flesh, and they were chosen, you know, for reasons only God knows. I suspect largely because they were so prodigal, and that they were sort of a living demonstration of, um, once again, that prodigality, that they can turn against God however many times they want, but ultimately reality leads them right back to Him. And so they're chosen as a demonstration, not as an exaltation, you know? And so this is the same sort of logic being applied by Dugin towards Russia, through a pre-existing school of Russian political thought. And it came from corruption of Russian Christianity. It came from the idea of the Third Rome and Holy Russia, which originally was just a dedication of the Russian nation to God and to Christianity, which is something very noble. But after the fall of Russia's Christian order in 1917, this became perverted and secularized and warped into a worship of the Russian nation, no matter what government it's under. So they venerate the communists as much as they venerate the czars. They venerate governments that were openly, like Carvalho says, that are destructive forces to all nations, simply because they see some benefit for themselves. Because they don't worship tradition, they worship their nation.
Whereas
Right,
also,
just real quick, JP, is this harkens back to Julius Evela's critique of Hitler's Germany. He says that this is the subjugation of the world of being to the world of becoming. By putting the German race at above everything else, and exalting that as the prime principle rather than exalting that which is eternal, and transforms the race. This is we can imagine Evola making this critique of Duga and saying that, look, you're putting the Russian people in their primary place instead of being the benefactor of the divinely created order and putting that in the very beginning.
where it's kind of strange on how America has done it with, well, I guess a strong arm philosophy in a sense, to where it's not really racial. It's more so, well, it's not even, well, I guess in a sense it could be egalitarian, but in another sense, it's like, well, we're bringing the West to you. You're going to like it or get out. It's that American superiority complex, and it's not even racial. It's not even, it's commodities. It's based on economic theory and capitalism, to where we have a real ego problem with that. Oh, why aren't they accepting of democracy? Well, we're not a democracy. But, and then the very fundamental nature of us having that America first or egotistical mindset, to where, we're acting in a manifest destiny capacity. So in a sense, I guess God's chosen in that sense, but it's more so on a commodity basis, and we're commodifying that rather than racializing it. That liberalism does that.
Yeah. And real quick before you jump in there, Rose. Yeah. That's a very materialistic way of looking at it, and it is it's the worship of material objects as being the highest truth. And it's sort of this idea, and I've seen this idea promoted even by a few on the dissident right, though certainly not most, which is that, material gain or material prosperity is somehow evidence of goodness. That, well, it's working well, in the present tense, in a material way. So therefore, that's evidence of it being good. I don't think that's true, especially because they take it out of context, right? And I see this most commonly applied towards America and towards the more Americanist factions within the dissident right. And really, they are completely leaving out the idea that America is a virgin continent that had all these resources before anybody landed there, before any ideas landed there. And it's a great irony that these people who are so materialist will then say that it was the ideas of the people and not the material resources of the continent itself that gave America its wealth. I just find that very ironic, or the industriousness of the people that settled there. It's just such a great ideological irony that they push so hard in that direction.
Yeah, I just wanted to hop in a little bit because you were saying, JP, about the American expansionism, and foreign meddling. It's about democracy and capitalism. Except the funny thing is if you look, your democracy means the people vote. We don't let the people vote. We put in, I even say we because want to get away from this idea that it's America doing this, because it's really powers that don't care for America and want to see America dwindle. These powers, put in these tin pot dictators in place. They don't listen to the people. But we see this, you saw this happen in Afghanistan, right? It was a country that's, well, it's not, the country doesn't disappear, but it's a 99% Muslim country that wants Sharia. So then why was there a government that was having pride parades? No one voted for that. If they voted, it would be shut down immediately, right? That's not democracy. Now, I'm not a fan of democracy, but, if it was democracy, you would be seeing a Islamic republic in Afghanistan, but you didn't. That's because it's not democracy. It's a top-down order. And same thing with capitalism. It's, capitalism is, if we take it as kind of definitional, being a free market, we don't see capitalism being expanded anywhere else. Rather, we see a bunch of mega corporations that are heavily subsidized by the government, like Amazon, McDonald's. People don't, take the time to think that they pay no money in taxes. They get a bunch of subsidies by the government. They are quasi-government agencies. We don't think of them as nationalized industries, but they basically are there. They have no existence independent from the U.S. federal government. So, this is kind of the do-goodness argument says, oh, look, they're spreading democracy and capitalism. Well, it's really a top-down, authoritative governmental structure that's imposed upon people against their will. And it's a quasi-socialistic economic system that's imposed. Not to be the defender of capitalism and democracy, but it's really not what's being imposed.
Settle down, Bernie Sanders. But there is, and there is that. The theme is just, it's so prominent. And you said something about we wouldn't have much of a problem with Sharia law being imposed if it was voted in. Which is okay, because we wouldn't have a problem with communism if it was voted in. It's
no. I'm saying that the idea that America is exporting democracy is false, because if it was democracy, then Afghanistan would have had Sharia law 20 years ago. It wouldn't have had to wait for the U.S. forces to be kicked out. Right. And I was saying that it's not capitalism that's being imposed, because what companies are showing up there, well, it's Amazon and it's McDonald's, and they're at this point basically government-run agencies. So it's more of a socialism than a capitalism that's being imposed.
Yeah, and I mean, in a sense, Islam kind of embraces a caste system in of its own right, because there's the different denominations of Islam, and I know this is going to relate to what I guess you would call, Rose, the kind of like the godfather of traditionalism in a sense, Gurnan, which Sufi Islam is a whole different aspect, a whole different, well, I'm not going to say animal, a whole different part of Islam that is, different from the Shiite, the Sunni, the Baha'i, and I don't know if there's other derivatives out there, so forgive me. But there is also a sense of it like him having that capital T traditionalist stance on it, taking the hard position on it versus, I guess what you said with, we wouldn't be there for 20 years if they weren't subjugated to quote unquote democracy. So that's just interesting in and of itself, because it gives way to, them having completely different outlooks on us, as Dugan has different outlooks on us as Americans. So with that highly individualistic mindset, obviously the other cultures around the world just don't see it that way. And that's, infects itself towards different cultures, different belief systems, different religions. And in a sense, I mean, I can, as a Christian, as hard as it is to say this, but in a sense, I can empathize with the Muslims over there and them being sick of what woke liberalism brought to the table, and them being as godless as they are. So there, in fact, lies Gurnan.
Exactly. That's why a lot of traditionalists end up leaving Christianity of some sort and becoming a Sufi, which, depending on which Muslim you talk to, is either, the heart of Islam or is a radical heresy, kind of like our version of Origenism. So it's a touchy subject within Islam, but it's, they come from either Protestantism or Catholicism. Typically it's Catholicism. And they see their society, going the way of, all sorts of, the decastizing, I guess, to coin another phrase tonight, of society. And there's no more hierarchy anymore. There's no vocation. You're not called to be anything. You can be whoever or whatever you want, and that applies to gender, sexuality, right? All these things are negative, and they're saying, and then they look that, like, I thought my society was Catholic. I thought it was Christian. But what's happening here? And they look over to the Middle East, into Indonesia. And fun fact, Indonesia is actually where most of the world's populations of Muslims are. Middle East is only about 20 to 30%. The rest are Indonesia mostly. And they see that because of the opposition the Middle East has had with the West, and with the West going the trajectory it is with social liberalism, due to that political opposition, the Middle East has maintained a lot of socially conservative values. So because of that, because of this political divide between, the West and the Middle East, it makes Islam a very attractive option. So you have people like Gurnan that converted to Sufi Islam, people like Frithjof Schuon also converted to Sufi Islam. So it's interesting how a political divide created kind of this trend of a lot of traditionalists going the way of Sufis.
Yeah. And sort of that trend, right, of really old school Orientalism in the West. And it manifested in many different ways in the 19th and early 20th centuries. But you had sort of the more cultural one where, it was kind of taboo. So you've got in the Victorian era these paintings of these, scantily clad women, but it's okay because it's in the East, where this is just how things are, the portrayal of this decadence on one hand. And then on the other hand, you've got people who view it as more traditional, like these capital T traditionalist schools that embrace it. But this began much earlier. Guénon, actually, I believe he got a lot of his following on that from Arthur de Gobineau. And I know we had talked about him a little bit, Rose, one time. I don't know if you had asked about him. I don't know if you ever ended up reading anything by him, but yeah, he started a lot of this trend in the West because he was a diplomatic minister in France during the 1850s, but he came from the old French nobility, and he was a kind of a French reactionary in the old sense, who was kind of a transition into capital T traditionalism, or like a proto-traditionalism, because he had this sort of Eastern way of viewing things, and he was very infatuated and fascinated with Persia. He was on diplomatic mission to Iran a lot in his later years. He picked up a lot of Persian ideas and customs and started studying their traditions very heavily. And then learned a lot about the Indian caste system as well. But he saw the French Revolution as being this uncasting, if you will, of France. He actually portrayed it, and he was also a very early biological racialist, because he talked about how the French Revolution was kind of a Gallo-Roman uprising against the Frankish nobility, which, while it is a bit of a typecasting and doesn't fit exactly, there is some element of truth to that. He speaks about, and mind you, this is a person who would have been alive during this time period, very young. Talks about people with blonde features, being killed for looking like nobility. Things like this in France during the French Revolution, which was undoubtedly a blatant example of uncasting and of destruction of both small and capital T tradition in France. So he was kind of a very early starting point for this school of philosophy.
Yeah, there's definitely a bunch of Oriental underpinnings and precursors. I still have not read him, unfortunately, but he's on my reading list.
Well, I guess JP don't have a rant on that one, so I guess I'll find something else. So talking about Sufis as being in the chat here as being Muslim monks, yeah, the monastic tradition. That is an interesting idea, and honestly, monasticism is something that I really don't have a very good understanding of. I know hesychasm is often seen as being an alternative to Western rationalism in the Orthodox tradition. I know that it's often kind of seen as being an alternative to the hubristic attempt at understanding God. So I don't know if y'all have any greater wisdom on that subject than I do, but I'm curious to hear it.
Well, St. Gregory Palamas, St. Joseph, and then the father of the monastic order or monasticism would be St. Anthony the Great. All had, obviously, as the church fathers go, all had various ways to go about it. Saint Joseph, I think, being the most prominent when it comes to the hesychastic tradition. Saint Gregory Palamas propped it up, and obviously Saint Anthony being the progenitor of the monastic order and finding a way to combat Gnosticism, rationalism, isms abound, low T traditions. It being that life, that logos, that prominence, that, and I'm going completely pro-Orthodox here, being that Eucharist that is just uncanny, that is just untouchable, because obviously God is. But there's something that the West just doesn't give itself within the answer to the East. The hesychastic tradition and the monastic tradition gives that life that, like both of you guys said, is innate in all of us, is innate as either a hibernating bear or a roaring lion. And I mean that in the sense of, obviously, both of those, I guess I picked two predatory animals. Sorry, Darwin, but screw you. There is that sense that there is, the sleeping bear is such a good metaphor because you got to poke the bear and it wakes up. And then once it wakes up, it's roaring. It's mad because you woke the bear up and it's mad. Time to eat. And then, once you got a roaring lion, well, that roaring lion's got to kind of calm down and humble itself, right? So in a sense, you have both those animals, but to get into a point where, obviously, to break away from the animal mind into the human mind, that puts us above animals in the hierarchy, in the natural order. But in a sense, the hesychastic tradition takes that animal nature out of us, throws it away, death to the world, passions are gone. So with that, all those isms running around, running amok, doing God knows what, gives way to us becoming more familiar with God. And I mean, hesychasm in and of itself is, in its most fundamental sense, prayer in practice. You're getting to the point where prayer is so essential, and that hesychasm is speaking to you. Well, it's God speaking to you, but it's also succumbing to those virtues and becoming those virtues and knowing that you're a part of something else. You're a part of God. And with hesychasm, the Eucharist, there's also communion. You need to be in that mindset, in that communal mindset. And believe me, there's some weeks I'm better at it. There's some weeks I'm not. And I'm not the church going type either, to where you get to that point and you're like, yeah, I'm there. That's my mind. I'm there. But I don't, but then you can't rationalize it. So there's a lot of back and forth. It's dynamic, and there's not a hard definition to hesychasm. There's obviously a harder definition to the Eucharist, because that's, the literal physical manifestation. Whereas hesychasm is more of a communal, spiritual, and physical manifestation within ourselves. Because we humble ourselves to God, we humble ourselves to prayer, we humble ourselves to not be like animals, not to just go out and fulfill our most carnal desires and be just acting on our impulses. With loads of Mountain Dew, that might be possible for me. But it's to the point where you get into that mindset that just sets. I mean, the Orthodox Church is so completely different to where that monastic order had to establish those kind of, I don't know if I want to say ethos here. That's because that's not doing justice to these the precedents that, you know, those saints set, because they're saints for a reason, and they're better men than me. So let's get, you know, I mean, I don't know. If you guys can take it somewhere, and obviously Rose is a little bit better than I am at it, but to me, it just speaks to our innate ability as human beings to be able to get into a different mode and get into a different mindset to where we can take off and know God.
I really shouldn't be speaking about hesychasm, if I'm perfectly honest.
Yeah, I mean that was just a quick question because I had very little understanding of it, mostly because it kind of connected with what was going on in the chat. So yeah, that makes sense. But once again, it's almost like by asking some of these questions, I'm making a statement. And so just because of that, I really don't even want to do that in that case. So this is a topic for another time. But anyway, now that we kind of derailed in a sense, we've talked about traditionalism in religion and Christianity specifically, and how they're compatible. We've talked about traditionalist politics and how they vary, and how they manifest, and just how those sorts of things blend together. I guess by discussing the lives of these philosophers and writers, we've sort of had a rudimentary history of the traditionalist school, going back to its earliest foundings in the 19th century. So is there anything else that we're going to try to cover now that we're at the 2-hour mark?
Just to tickle the fancy a little bit. I think that there might be, an obvious truth, an absolute truth, and big T traditionalism points to where, like Rose said, there's that mysticism to the Sufi end of the spectrum when it comes to Islam. Well, it's interesting to me because it's like, why would somebody who's Protestant or Catholic go and do yoga? What are they missing? Where's that mysticism coming from? Where's that wanting for more mysticism, albeit not the proper one, but that hunger? Where does that come from? Is there something you're not getting within your confessed faith, or to where you don't feel professed or secure enough as a Christian? Because I know most of the time I sure don't, in fear and trembling of God. But as to say, as we say as Orthodox Christians, that we're unworthy of God's love, but God loves us so much that we don't know how worthy we are of his love. Yeah, I mean, that's a lot of hesychasm right there. And to open it up even more, it's like, why is that mysticism missing? Where is it? Is it in low T traditionalism? Is it in uppercase traditionalism? Or is it something more ascendant than what we are? And to me, it's like you're always trying to replace those empty parts of your soul, your spirit, your being into what? What are you trying to contextualize it? What are you trying to manifest within yourself as to look to something else for those answers?
Yeah, I'll go. I, but anyway, yeah, and I can see where in the West that manifests itself into rationalism, into this idea of attempting to pierce the veil, um, and lay out everything in a way that the senses can understand. Um, seeing those feelings and those attempts at reaching for mysticism or whatever within one's mind and saying, well, why do I think that way? Surely there's a material explanation for why I desire this immaterial thing. And then you break it all down that way. And then you have a lot of these other religions who will engage in practices that, like we discussed earlier, amount to inviting demons into oneself, through mysticism that attempts to pierce that veil once again. And what I'm seeing with hesychasm here is it is a kind of prostration of one's intellect before God, and sort of an opening up and saying, Lord, you know, I don't know. I really am a fallen, ignorant sinner. My senses cannot comprehend your glory. Enlighten me, Lord. That's all I can really see in this as being, consistent with everything that we've already discussed. So ultimately, I think anything outside of that, um, to things that go beyond the human sense's ability to process, really is quite a dangerous venture.
I mean, yeah, St. Paisos always rings true with this. And he was hesychastic for sure, but, he saw it through and he really brought it to light. So I'll say this as a prayer to close. O Heavenly King, the Comforter, the Spirit of Truth, who art everywhere and fillest all things, treasury of blessings and giver of life, come and abide in us and cleanse us from every impurity and save our souls, O good one. Glory to thee, our God, glory to thee. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Oh man.
Amen.
So I'm hoping we didn't cut Rose out with that, because
Oh, yeah, Rosie.
I wanted to
I'm
make sure
here.
he didn't have anything else to say.
No. I think we covered a lot of topics, and we went into fairly good detail with each of them. So I'm just very happy.
All right.
I feel like we've achieved a pretty good amount of information density within these 2 hours. So yeah, I'm thoroughly satisfied. So, gentlemen, it's been a pleasure.
Definitely has, man.
It has. Thank you for having me on.
You're welcome back anytime.
Thank you.
God bless you guys.
You too, man.
Y'all take care. Bye bye.
Too. Bye-bye. Rosie.
We're still live.
Oh, crap.